September 28th, 1213, a date burned into the darkest pages of Hungarian history. Deep within the cold, echoing stone walls of Peles Castle, a sound shattered the silence, the kind of scream that doesn't ask for help, but signals a horror already unleashed. Servants rushed toward the royal chambers, only to be met with a vision so grotesque it would haunt generations. Queen Gertrude of Merania, once one of the most powerful women in Central Europe, lay sprawled across the blood-slicked floor, her limbs hacked apart, her abdomen slashed open, and her head nearly severed, hanging from the neck by nothing more than shreds of sinew and flesh. Her golden hair was soaked in her own blood, her body carved with terrifying precision, not in rage, but with chilling ritual. This wasn't a murder. It was a message. The assassins, long gone, left no doubt about their intent. Foreign domination of Hungary would end here, in blood and bone. Just hours earlier, she had dined with courtiers, smiled at servants, ruled with supreme confidence. Now she was nothing more than a butchered body on cold stone, and no one dared to speak her name. News of the slaughter spread like wildfire through the castle, then through the kingdom, and soon across Europe. But this was no random act of violence. This was a political execution disguised as a massacre, a calculated strike against the woman many Hungarians saw as a conqueror cloaked in royal robes. And when King Andrew II returned from his crusade to find his wife's mutilated corpse, when he looked into the void her death had created, he would not weep. He would vow vengeance so cruel, so theatrical, that it would be remembered for centuries. What happened behind those chamber doors? Why was Gertrude, a queen, targeted with such savagery, and what chain of power, betrayal, and fury led to one of the most gruesome assassinations in medieval European history? To answer that, we must go back to where it all began, in a foreign court, with a beautiful girl raised not to serve, but to rule, before she was torn limb from limb, before she was called a tyrant in silks or the German queen who bled Hungary dry. Gertrude of Merania was a child of glittering courts and sharpened ambitions. Born around the year 1185 in the Duchy of Merania, a now-forgotten territory straddling what we know today as Austria and Slovenia, she was no ordinary noble girl. She was raised not to be someone's wife, but someone's problem. Her father, Duke Berthold Far, ruled over a polished yet ruthless corner of the Holy Roman Empire, where diplomacy was war and pearls and etiquette hid daggers. In this world, Gertrude learned early how power moved through rooms not by who shouted loudest, but by who smiled last. Contemporary accounts describe her as ethereal hair the color of ripe wheat, eyes blue as alpine lakes, skin pale and flawless, a beauty that seemed carved from ivory. But behind that angelic facade was a calculating intelligence that made seasoned diplomats uncomfortable. She listened more than she spoke, remembered everything, and understood instinctively that affection was a tool, not a need. By her teenage years, she had already become the centerpiece of her family's geopolitical strategy, not a daughter, but a chess piece, prepared to marry for conquest, not for love. That opportunity came in 1203 when Gertrude was just 18, across the mountains in Hungary. King Andrew II was facing mounting internal pressure, restless nobles, weakening borders, and a fragile claim to the throne. He didn't need a queen. He needed leverage. And Gertrude's family, the House of Andechs, had exactly that: military resources, German prestige, and a web of alliances that could secure Hungary's western flank. Their marriage was sealed not with vows, but with negotiations, not in candlelit chapels, but across maps stained with ink and blood. It was, in every sense, a transaction. And Gertrude understood the terms perfectly. When she arrived in Hungary in 1204, The fanfare was blinding. Trumpets, silk banners, and lavish feasts welcomed the radiant German bride. Crowds filled the streets of Székesfehérvár to witness her coronation, a moment choreographed to display unity, strength, and promise. To the Hungarian people, she was a symbol of hope, a link to powerful Western allies, and, perhaps, a queen who might bring elegance to a rugged kingdom still finding its place in post-Crusade Europe. For a moment, it worked. Gertrude smiled, played the role, and let them adore her. But beneath the velvet and ceremony, she was already planning her next move. Because Gertrude did not see Hungary as her new home. She saw it as her new project. She understood what most foreign royals did not. Power in Hungary was not inherited. It was negotiated. The throne was only as strong as the nobles who stood behind it, and those nobles had long ruled like miniature kings over their fiefdoms. But Gertrude had no interest in playing by local rules. Why honor traditions designed to keep her in check? Why appease barons who sneered at her accent and whispered "foreigner" behind her back? No, she would build her own power base. And she would do it the same way rulers always had, through blood, gold, and family. Almost immediately, she began importing her own people into the kingdom. Brothers, cousins, in-laws, German knights and clerics, many of whom could barely speak Hungarian. She installed them in key roles: treasurer, military commanders, advisors to the king. Positions that for generations had been held by native Hungarian aristocrats were suddenly handed to foreign upstarts. To Gertrude, it was loyalty. To the nobility, it was a silent invasion. But she didn't stop there. With Andrew increasingly besotted by her beauty and cunning, Gertrude began to wield influence far beyond that of a typical consort. She sat in on council meetings, swayed foreign policy, even handpicked military leaders' decisions that traditionally belonged to the king alone. In public, she smiled. In private, she governed. Hungary was no longer a shared throne. It was hers to mold. And yet, even as she climbed higher, the ground beneath her began to tremble. The Hungarian nobles were not fools. They watched their lands eroded, their customs dismissed, their authority usurped, all by a queen who treated their country like a prize she had already won. What began as quiet resentment fermented into fury. And Gertrude, for all her brilliance, made one fatal mistake. She thought their silence meant surrender. It didn't. It meant war was coming. Because in medieval Hungary, vengeance wasn't served cold. It was served ritualistically and with steel. At first, the changes came quietly. An appointment here, a new advisor there. Few suspected that behind the marble columns of the royal court, Queen Gertrude was not adapting to Hungary, she was reprogramming it. But by the time the nobility realized what was happening, it was already too late. The German queen had wrapped her hands around the kingdom's levers of power, and she had no intention of letting go. One by one, the most sacred traditions of the Hungarian court began to erode. Centuries-old roles, chancellors, treasurers, commanders once reserved for the kingdom's proudest noble families were handed to German relatives and foreign courtiers. They arrived in droves, speaking a different tongue, dressed in the polished elegance of the Holy Roman Empire. Their mannerisms stiff and cold compared to the rugged plainsmen of the East. To Gertrude, these appointments were acts of loyalty. To the Hungarian aristocracy, it was a surgical cultural invasion disguised as royal administration. The whispers began behind closed doors. She's not one of us. She serves her own blood, not ours. Our country is being sold to foreigners. And worse, she controls the king. They weren't entirely wrong. King Andrew II, once decisive and pious, had grown softer, more detached. He deferred more and more to Gertrude's judgment, seduced not just by her beauty, but by her political mind. She flattered him, supported his crusading ambitions, and convinced him he could become both a warrior of Christ and a reformer king. What he didn't see or chose not to was that he had become a figurehead in his own palace, while Gertrude restructured Hungary like a board game, one piece at a time. Her policies deepened the wounds. She persuaded Andrew to reduce taxes for German merchants while increasing the burden on Hungarian estates. She pushed for border agreements that favored her family in Merania, seceding contested land with no consultation. When native generals protested, she removed them, replacing them with German commanders who had never stepped foot on the Hungarian battlefield. She was no longer just a queen. She was an occupying force wearing a crown. And then, the unthinkable. In 1212, Gertrude pushed Andrew to take the cross and join the Fifth Crusade. It seemed like a holy mission, but for Gertrude, it was strategy. With her husband out of the country, there would be no resistance left. The moment his ship vanished over the horizon, she declared herself regent and took total control of the kingdom. What followed was not rule. It was regime. She raised taxes on the nobility. She distributed lands to German immigrants. She enforced edicts that bypassed the traditional councils entirely. And at the top of it all, she named a German lord, one of her own cousins, as the supreme commander of the Hungarian military, stripping native nobles of their power and their pride in one calculated stroke. By now, even her former allies fell silent. The court had become a German satellite orbiting a Hungarian throne. The language changed, the laws changed, the faces in power changed, and yet, Gertrude continued, oblivious or indifferent to the powder keg she was sitting on. She underestimated them, because while she governed with confidence, the Hungarian nobility began to unite in secret. For the first time in years, rival barons set aside blood feuds to face a common enemy. Their meetings were quiet, held at night in candle-lit halls behind fortress doors. At their center stood one man, Bankban, a seasoned general, 50 years old, proud, scarred by war, and once loyal to the king. Gertrude had humiliated his family by removing his brother from office and handing their ancestral lands to a German lord. For Bankban, this was not just politics, it was personal. He saw Gertrude's regency as an existential threat not just to the nobility, but to Hungary itself. A nation with a 1,000-year history was being carved up like spoils from a foreign conquest. The conspirators believed that if they did not act now, there would be nothing left of Hungary but a name and a crown held by foreigners. But what could they do? She was queen. She was regent. She had the army, the castle, the king's seal. One false move, and they'd be hanged. But they also knew this: if they did nothing, they'd lose everything. So the plan was set. Not to exile, not to shame, to eliminate. Because in the medieval world, power didn't shift through debates or laws, it shifted through blood. And Gertrude was about to learn that there are limits even for a queen, especially when the people you rule begin to feel like strangers in their own country. It didn't happen in a courtroom. It didn't happen in public. It happened with steel. On the morning of September 28th, 1213, Pellis Castle woke to the sound of wind rustling through the trees and hooves clattering against cobblestone. The sky was overcast, the air strangely still, as if history itself was holding its breath. In the royal chambers, Queen Gertrude prepared for another day of rule, unaware that it would be her last. Her husband, King Andrew II, was thousands of miles away on crusade. The throne was hers, or so she believed. What happened next is still debated by historians. Some say it took place within the castle walls, that the queen was ambushed in her private quarters. Others claim it happened deep in the woods, during a royal hunt in the Piss Mountains. But one truth unites all versions: this was not a spontaneous act of violence. This was a message carved into flesh. The assassins were not rebels or peasants. They were nobles, men of rank and title, bound by centuries of blood and land to the kingdom. And they had waited patiently for this moment. Gertrude, confident in her power, had let her guard down. She had no army around her, no iron gates between her and those she had humiliated, only silk robes, soft stone, and the blind trust of a woman who believed herself untouchable. When they struck, it was fast and merciless. A sword across the throat silenced her scream before it could echo. But they didn't stop there. Because this wasn't about death, it was about ritual. With terrifying precision, they began the dismemberment. Her hands, the same hands that had signed decrees handing Hungarian lands to Germans, were hacked off first. Then her feet, which had walked across Hungary like she owned it. Finally, her head, nearly severed from her neck, left dangling by tendons like a grotesque puppet whose strings had snapped. Her golden hair, once admired in court poems, was now soaked in her own blood. It wasn't just a killing. It was an execution staged for no audience, but meant for an entire nation. The room where she died became a nightmare of gore. Walls streaked with crimson, floor slick with blood, pieces of flesh scattered like refuse. When servants finally dared to enter, some fainted, others vomited, none spoke. Her body, or what remained of it, was wrapped in linen and locked away, not out of respect, but out of sheer horror. News spread like wildfire. Within days, every noble in Hungary had heard the story. Within weeks, it had reached the Holy Roman Empire. And in Merania, her homeland, it landed like thunder. Her brothers demanded justice. Her family accused the Hungarian court of treason. Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire considered sending troops. But nothing would compare to the storm that was coming from the east, from the deserts of the Holy Land. Because King Andrew II, pious, proud, and newly blooded from crusade, was coming home. And when he arrived in 1214 and saw what had been done to his wife, the transformation was immediate. The king who had left Hungary in the name of Christ returned as something else entirely, a man possessed by vengeance. But that part of the story hadn't begun yet. Not on that day. On that day, the castle stood silent. The conspirators had already vanished into their estates, cloaked in noble privilege and silence. There was no trial, no claim of responsibility. Only the queen's shattered body and a kingdom that suddenly felt like it had crossed a line it could never uncross. And yet, there was no mourning. Not really. To many in the Hungarian nobility, this was justice delivered in the only language power understands blood. The foreign queen had been erased not by vote or exile, but by steel. They didn't celebrate, but they didn't hide either. They believed for a brief, dangerous moment that the kingdom belonged to them again. They were wrong. Because while Gertrude lay cold and broken, a new terror was already forming. A vengeance not of whispers and plots, but of public executions, torture chambers, and sharpened stakes. The queen had been cut to pieces, but the price for touching a crown, even one worn by a foreigner, was about to be paid in full. This was no rebellion. This was a reckoning. When Andrew II stepped off his ship in 1214, he expected to return to a kingdom in prayer. What he found was a kingdom soaked in blood. Word of Gertrude's assassination had reached him weeks earlier, but no message, no report, no envoy could prepare him for the truth. His wife hadn't just been murdered. She had been ritually dismantled, her body turned into a political statement. He was handed what remained of her in a linen-wrapped box, her head barely attached, her limbs missing. What once dazzled the courts of Europe now looked like butcher's waste. The king did not weep. He didn't scream. He didn't speak. Witnesses said his eyes darkened in a way they'd never seen before, like something holy had been emptied out of him. The man who had marched under the sign of the cross, who had knelt at Christ's tomb, returned home not as a pilgrim, but as an executioner. Within days, he summoned his council. Not to mourn, not to investigate, but to declare vengeance. He stood before Hungary's lords and said, not asked, that every conspirator would pay. Not just with death, but with a death that would terrify generations. There would be no forgiveness, no exile, no mercy. They will feel what I felt, he said, and the world will watch. A kingdom once divided, now united in fear. Andrew weaponized every tool of the state's spies, soldiers, scribes. He offered fortunes for information, tortured witnesses, interrogated families. The network of conspirators began to crumble. One by one, names surfaced. Some nobles fled, others were dragged from their manors in chains. But the one man Andrew truly wanted Bankban. The mastermind remained elusive. That is, until winter, when he was caught trying to cross the Tisa River disguised as a merchant. He was shackled, beaten, and brought to Buda in chains. Andrew didn't hide him. He paraded him through the capital like a trophy, the man who had killed his queen. The trial that followed was a farce. The verdict was already written, but Andrew wanted something more, a performance. The execution was set for May 1st, 1215 in the main square of Buda. Attendance was mandatory for every noble in the kingdom. It wasn't about punishment. It was about sending a message that no crown could be touched, no royal blood spilled without a reckoning. And the chosen method was no accident impalement, one of the most excruciating, humiliating deaths imaginable. That day, the square was packed with nobles in formal dress, forced to watch. Bankban, 50 years old, starved, broken, but still defiant, was dragged to the center. When offered a final confession, he refused. He didn't beg. He didn't cry. He only stared at the king. The execution lasted nearly 4 hours. A sharpened wooden stake was slowly driven into Bankban's body, piercing through muscle, organs, spine. It did not kill him quickly. That was the point. He screamed until his voice broke, and Andrew stood there the entire time watching, unblinking, unmoved. But even this wasn't enough. In the weeks that followed, Andrew launched a purge. Every co-conspirator was hunted, tortured, and executed. Entire families were banished. Lands confiscated. Names erased from royal records. In Hungary, it became clear the age of negotiation was over. Andrew no longer ruled with law. He ruled with fear, and the nobles got the message. They stopped questioning the throne. They stopped whispering behind closed doors, because they had seen what happened to men who did. The stake in Buda Square stood as a symbol not of justice, but of terror. Ironically, Gertrude's brutal death did not restore peace. It only replaced one tyranny with another. The woman who once ruled with arrogance had been replaced by a king who ruled with trauma. Andrew had avenged his wife, but in doing so, he became the very monster he had sworn to destroy. The blood had dried. The screams had faded. But nothing in Hungary would ever be the same. King Andrew II had avenged his wife with medieval precision through public torture, mass executions, and the kind of calculated cruelty that rewrites the political order. The conspirators were dead, their families destroyed, their names scrubbed from memory. And yet, the kingdom remained fractured, unstable, adrift in the very chaos Gertrude had once been blamed for creating. No balance had been restored, only silence. A silence not born of peace, but of fear. In the aftermath, Andrew II was never the same. The king who had once marched to Jerusalem with a cross on his chest now ruled from a throne soaked in vengeance. He no longer inspired faith. He inspired obedience. His laws became harsher, his moods darker. The crusader had returned from the Holy Land with blood still on his hands, but it wasn't Muslim blood. It was Hungarian. And Gertrude. Her death became legend, her memory divided by perspective. To some, she was a martyr, a cultured queen destroyed by xenophobia and political jealousy. To others, she was a tyrant in velvet, a foreign manipulator who disrespected traditions and paid the ultimate price. But the truth is more uncomfortable: she was both, and neither. Because Gertrude wasn't killed for being evil. She was killed for being powerful, foreign, and female in a kingdom that feared all three. And Andrew didn't just punish her killers, he punished an entire nation for letting it happen. Hungary didn't bury its queen. It buried its future. This is what makes the story timeless. It's not just about medieval politics or royal bloodshed. It's about what happens when power becomes personal, when grief is weaponized, when vengeance is dressed up as justice. These are themes that still echo from the halls of government to the dynamics of daily life. In every society, there is a line where leadership becomes domination, where protection becomes control. Andrew crossed that line. And so did those who killed his wife. Centuries later, historians still debate what Gertrude's murder meant. But maybe the better question is, what did it cost? The answer is everything. It cost Hungary its political stability. It cost the nobility its voice. It cost Andrew his soul. And it cost every generation after them the chance to ask, what if we had chosen restraint over rage, because power without accountability never brings peace, and vengeance without limits never brings justice? It brings only ghosts. There are lessons here, even now, especially now, in an era where political polarization runs deep, where foreignness is still weaponized, and where women in power are often scrutinized more for their identity than their decisions. The story of Queen Gertrude and King Andrew holds up a mirror. It asks us what happens when we demonize those who are different. What price do we pay when we confuse silence with order? And how many times must history teach us that violence, once unleashed, cannot be contained? Gertrude died over 800 years ago, but her story still breathes, not in statues, not in songs, but in warnings. Warnings about ambition, fear, revenge, and what it means to mistake destruction for strength. Because in the end, no one won. Not the queen who ruled without listening, not the nobles who killed to reclaim their pride, and not the king who avenged his wife by crushing his people. There were no victors in this story, only victims. If this story gripped you as much as it did us, don't just scroll past. What do you think? Was Queen Gertrude a victim of hatred, or a tyrant in disguise? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. If you love dark history, don't forget to save this video so you can revisit the story anytime, and subscribe for more tales that history tried to bury. One click helps keep forgotten voices alive.